Our second speaker is Brendan Shay Basham. Brendan is a writer, artist, educator, and recovering chef who writes beautifully about food and cooking. That's just an aside. Okay. Brendan was born in Alaska and raised in northern Arizona. He received his MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and a BA in liberal arts from the Evergreen State College. His debut novel, Swim Home to the Vanished, was released August 22nd, 2023 from Harper Books, flagship imprint of HarperCollins. Brendan is a recipient of Poetry Northwest's inaugural James Welch Prize for Indigenous Writers, the Ucross Foundation's first Native American Literary Award, and fellowships from the Truman Capote Trust, Writing by Writers, and Tin House. He's a fiction faculty member at University of Nevada, Reno, Lake Tahoe's creative writing MFA program, and he currently lives in the Zuni Mountains of New Mexico. Brendan.
Hi.
Hi.
Not yet. Whenever I get up to speak, I like to stare at everyone in the eyeballs because it makes you more awkward than me. Ja, bine, Shay Tó Ts'ohnii nishle, bit ani Shay Basham Basham Afnat no dos Diné, Tashdinal, Arodok o sleep. In Navajo, we like to introduce our clans before anything else. So I said, good morning, my clans are Tó Ts'ohnii, which is big water. The English translation is big water clan on my mother's side. And then Besh Bichani Bashachin is the quilted skirt people. So Irish. And Apnat no dos Diné is the metal helmeted people, which is German. And I'm from the western sacred mountains of Arizona. So thank you, Sama, and thank you for the invite to our organizers and everyone else who makes these kind of essential programs possible. It's an honor to be here. And I want to talk about my friend Tommy's book by talking about myself. And I'm really happy that Julie had this talk this morning because it kind of leads, it's a nice lead up into what I'd like to talk about today. So I was born in Alaska. I was raised in northern Flagstaff, around Flagstaff, and since I was a little kid, I've been traveling a lot. And so born in Anchorage, lived in Fairbanks and Fort Yukon on the Arctic Circle in Alaska. Road trips down to New Mexico, basically was raised out of a VW bus that my dad rebuilt. And lived in Flagstaff, lived on the Navajo Reservation, Farmington, Aztec, Tijeras, back to Flagstaff where I graduated high school. And this was there's a lot of movement in my early days, right? And right away, there's this kind of non-stable, or you might not think it's an unstable way of living, but now I realize decades later that this is part of my life, this is part of who I am. I belong on the road and I have a home. Not in that sense that we call home. I'm an Indian from the city who grew up in the city, but I'm also an Indian from the res. And when you're an Indian in the city, you get beat up because you're too Indian. And if you're Indian on the res, or you're white on the res, you get beat up because you're not Indian enough. My dad is white, my mom is Navajo. And right away, not right away, sorry, but let me start over again. All right, I have ADHD, and I want you to do your best to try to stay with me while I'm doing this. because I do want to talk about ADHD and I do want to talk about some mental illnesses and how generational trauma has kind of affected who we are today. In Wandering Stars, in the first chapter, I know that's not our common read, but I want to read a little section of that, but I also want to read a little section from this really quickly from there. If you're following along, it's page 9. Plenty of us are urban now, if not because we live in cities, then because we live on the internet. Inside the high-rise of multiple browser windows, they used to call us sidewalk Indians, called us cityfied, superficial, inauthentic, cultureless refugees. Apples. An apple is red on the outside and white on the inside. But what we are is what our ancestors did, how they survived. We are the memories we don't remember, which live in us, which we feel, which make us sing and dance and pray the way we do. Feelings for memories that flare and bloom unexpectedly in our lives like blood through a blanket from a wound made by a bullet fired by a man shooting us in the back for our hair, for our heads, for a bounty, or just to get rid of us. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I want to get back to my clan, Tó Ts'ohnii, eventually. So we're going to circle back. This is my great-grandfather, Diné, and which in Navajo means small boy. He was born on the Long Walk, which we call Juked, is the forced relocation of the Navajo people from their lands into eastern New Mexico. He was born on that long walk, and he was my mother's best friend growing up. And he died in the late 60s, and they thought he was around 102 or 104 years old when he passed. That's him. You can see the resemblance. Some of these slides are out of order too, so you know, again, stick with my brain here a little bit. So this is gonna work. So perception is cultural, and how we see is shaped by our upbringing. This is my mom's clan here. So the Tó Ts'ohnii clan is the folded arms people. And you can tell which one is my mom. So some of my Tó Ts'ohnii roots here are, and my Navajo roots kind of helped me think about these different things growing up and as I grew older. And because of this fun neurodivergence and I get to kind of dream about these things all the time at once. So organizing it was really fun. So in Navajo, the language is expressly tied to the land and to our religion. It's hard to learn the language without being on the land or knowing a little bit about how we look at the world and how things are. And when I study the language or any language, really, I love to see different ways of seeing. And that's a matter of curiosity. Like we should all have that kind of curiosity. Okay, I get some water, I'm a little parched. So in that language, it's a little phenomenological word, and what I mean by that is that the words don't necessarily mean what they are. So in the English language, which is inherently imperialistic, we like to put order to things, right? Everything has to be in its box. In many indigenous languages, the name for an object is in relation to the world around it. So the word for dog in Navajo is cléchant, which means literally ground shitter. Hojon is a very basic idea of Navajo belief systems where we're trying to reach balance and harmony. Obviously, colonialism and imperialism, which we've heard about from Julian. Thank you. The sacredness of all things. Strong family is very matrilineal and matriarchal. This is my father, my bilagáana side. So again, language, and I have this imperialistic background as well as my Navajo background. So I have this absorption of that way of looking at the world. The space-time is not integrated, it's not all things happening at once. It's more an urgent capitalist working towards whatever progress means. There's a strained relationship with the natural world. And luckily he grew up in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, and he went to Berkeley and San Francisco State. So he's this anti-capitalist hippie dad that I have. Curiosity, but again, these slides are old. I had 3 brothers, all really different, terribly awful, wonderful brothers. Traveled a lot, read a lot, went to Evergreen State College, which is a small liberal arts school in Olympia, Washington that does not have written grades, they have written evaluations. So you don't get a grade, you get a written evaluation. And it's all interdisciplinary study. And when your mind is kind of all over the place, interdisciplinary study works because science is art and art is science, right? There's not in the Navajo way of looking or in the indigenous way of looking at the world, is that these things are integrated. We're not trying to parse out the world. We're not going to necessarily put borders around the world and claim that this land is ours. Although all humans have that. They have that in them, right? There's a tribalistic instinct. And then I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts, which I'll get to in a second. So what I really would like to talk about is how maybe a modern Indian has been affected by ancient stories, and how I very recently was diagnosed with being bipolar and having anxiety disorder and PTSD and all those other things that are very intricately tied to each other. And when I started doing a little bit of research, I love, again, as soon as I have an interest in something, I'm going to dive into it and try to figure it out. And while I was at Evergreen, that's when I realized that that's when my mental illness really started acting up. And I think typically that's how it is in the late teens up into the early 20s, 24 or so. That's when a lot of mental illness start to reveal themselves. And in my research, I discovered something called complex PTSD, which in Native societies, I think we already know there are other names for having suffered and endured so much. But recently, in Western medicine, they've discovered and have done a lot of research on epigenetics. And epigenetics show that our DNA actually changes when we deal with lots of stress and trauma. And it's pretty stressful to be nearly eradicated. That's a joke about generational trauma. It's very hard to do. So I wanted to revise this idea of what I was, because I didn't feel sick, right? I felt different for sure my entire life. And I've been very moody my entire life. And as I did some research, it all started to make sense. So let me go back to Tó Ts'ohnii really quickly. So in the English translation, Tó Ts'ohnii, Tó is water. Tó kind of sounds like the drop of water. Tó, Tó, Tó. And Ts'ohnii is not actually big. I learned this in my research. It's actually expansive water. So when I left home and I started going to school and traveling around, I always thought that I was drawn to big water. I was drawn to oceans and lakes, and lived in the Puget Sound and Portland area, and lived in Puerto Rico for nearly 10 years, in Baltimore, New York briefly. And there's a fragmentation that kind of happens when you move around so much. And also I had this idea of who I was. I had this idea that I was Tó Ts'ohnii. But through this process of trying to revise the way that I thought of a mental illness, I realized that revision means also that translation of that word. And just one word transformed my whole life. Like Tó Ts'ohnii, which is not big water, it's expansive water. And I'll get to what I mean, like why that's so important in a minute too. When, so ADD thing here. I have 3 documents I'm working from here. I got some slides that are ancient, pile of books here, and another document here. So excuse me if I'm a little disorganized, but that's just how my brain works. My therapist, I told her once that I just really want to be one of those writers that can sit down every day and just work on their stuff, like systematically. I don't have a system. And she said, Brendan, you do have a system. It's chaos. Chaos is your system. And so I've been kind of living that hard. Let's back up again. In 2017, my mentor in the Institute of American Indian Arts was Tommy Orange, and he first read parts of there in the auditorium at the school, and I was sitting next to somebody, and I was already halfway through my manuscript, my thesis, and when he read, we were just like, the whole audience was blown away. And I leaned over to my friend next to me and I said, I have a lot of work to do. That's just an aside. My therapist also said some pretty profound things that even though at first they sounded like simple ideas, they're actually really profound. And in one of our early sessions, she said, thoughts are powerful things. Thoughts are powerful things. This seems so simplistic, but yeah, it's true. And that our brains are basically thought machines and there's no safe way of turning them off. And consciousness is constant, right? Consciousness is this river, this stream. It's not still water. It's expansive water. It keeps flowing no matter what, right? If there's cliffs, if there's sand, if there's a dam, it's still going to find a way through. It's going to seep through the sandstone eventually and get to the other side. It's going to go around those canyon walls. And if that's how consciousness is, then there's plenty of time for revision. If consciousness is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and revision is 90% of writing, then why can't we revise the way that our brains work? I'm not talking about revising history, but revising how we think about the world. And that's exactly what CBT is, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Are there any therapists or psychologists in here? So you might know a little bit about this. Forgive me, I'm I know nothing. Consciousness makes me anxious. So that's what I like to talk about. I like to talk about anxiety and how we can attempt to transform it into a good kind of anxiety. It is a word with weight and holds the power to create artists and writers out of us, but it can also act as a deterrent. Contradictions abound. Yesterday I was at Pat's Pizza. And I was one of the only people in there, and I ordered pizza and a drink. And the server there was just very great. All right, this is what I wrote about, and I'm going to read part of this. I've had a long few days with little motivation to write until this morning when I finally broke down crying on the phone with my ex. She had posted photos of our dog, Yazi, who has been in our lives 4 years as of this week. When we fostered this mutt who shit in our kitchen within an hour, not just in a corner like some normal nervous pup. She was more neurotic than that and somehow had backed into our kitchen table and smeared it around halfway up the legs, even though she's a tiny dog. It's impossible to describe because it seems such an impossible feat for a mutt this small. We thought she was a Cairn Terrier when we got her. It turned out she's Chihuahua, Shih Tzu, Poodle with Pit Bull, Husky, and a wolfiness factor of 10%, which is apparently very high. So as I'm writing in Pat's Pizza, I inadvertently confess to Logan, the server, that I'm nervous about today. And he is the third or fourth person within a few hours that I arrived up here to say, I'm sure you'll be great. Based on how long I've known you, he says. And he looks at his non-existent watch. He said, you've got a stoic calmness about you. And immediately I think that's what a lot of white people think of Indians, is that we're stoic. Then it was the receptionist at the hotel. And then it was the guy at the dispensary. If you're nervous, just think of that as excitement, the server said. And I told him, you know, you're annoyingly optimistic. And he said, it's the medication. It's the Lexapro. And I said, you must really need it this time of year. And he said, yeah. So mental illness is also when you go to Maine and there's a snowstorm and there's a bunch of these fuckers walking around in t-shirts and shorts. So my mental illness, and a lot of other people's mental illness, stems from this idea of complex PTSD, which is a change in our actual body, a physical change in our body. As a result, as a result of centuries of a fight or flight response, of trying to survive. So part of this survival thing I was thinking about for a long time is like, what is my home? Where am I from? I made fun of on the res, I made fun of in the city. Dad is white, mom is Navajo. Don't really have a home. In Navajo, you're supposed to, when you're born, you clip off. Very many cultures do this, but you chop off the umbilical cord and you bury it. And that, wherever your umbilical cord is buried, that's where you live. That's where you're from. You're always going to be grounded to the earth in that way. I have no idea where my umbilical cord is. Yeah. Okay. That's good stuff.
Oh, it's like, God.
I didn't think I was on mushrooms today. I'm gonna read this prologue from Wandering Stars, or just the first paragraphs. There were children, and then there were the children of Indians, because the merciless, savage inhabitants of these American lands did not make children, but nits, and nits make lice. And so it was said by the man who meant to make a massacre feel like killing bugs at Sand Creek, when 700 drunken men came down at dawn with cannons, and then again 4 years later, almost to the day, the same way at the Washita River, where afterwards 700 Indian horses were rounded up and shot in the head. These kinds of events were called battles, then later, sometimes massacres in America's longest war. More years at war with Indians than as a nation, 313. After all the killing and removing, scattering and rounding up of Indian people to put them on reservations, and after the buffalo population was reduced from about 30 million to a few hundred in the wild, the thinking being every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, there came another campaign-style slogan directed at the Indian problem: kill the Indian, save the man. Wonderful opening paragraph. So worldly is something that someone has called me before, and worldly is a contradictory word, because the more we learn about the world, the less the world makes sense. And the more that we try to articulate the emotions and try to process those emotions and learn the vocabulary of the world and of life and of consciousness, the less it makes sense. We might say life itself is a contradiction. This is what it means to be human. Look at Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov murders his landlady with an axe early in the novel, and the rest of the book follows his anxieties. The story is about the repercussions of his conscience. You see it in his twitchy motions, interactions with his detective and family members. Notes from Underground also show the mania, the thought process of a judgmental man, the contradictions around every corner. Which begs the question, if contradictions are already absurd, what new connections can we make in our imagination? A whole realm of meaning-making possibilities reveals itself. Some of these images alone are powerful. Some of these images are powerful alone, but what happens when two or more seemingly disparate objects are put together? You get a new piece of art. Oh, those are my brothers. I'm the cat. And it's my older half brother Ray. I have another older half brother. When my parents met, they both had sons. And Tristan was my full-blooded real brother. My real brother. So this anxiety becomes more difficult for those of us with grief and PTSD and generational trauma. Our animal instincts kick in. Our bodies and minds are overly conserved with survival, of getting it through the next 30 minutes. I'm used to speaking to people, but still, I'm very excited. I'm not anxious, I'm very excited. So growing up and not realizing, not knowing this vocabulary, it's very hard to describe like what it feels like growing up like this until you're much older, realizing that you've been cut, you've been surviving, I guess, a million microaggressions, like paper cuts. And my therapist and I decided that I don't want to just survive. we don't want to just survive, we want to live. And I told her, but I despise other people. I don't want to live like other people. And she said, that's all or nothing thinking. She says, you don't have to be like them. In fact, you can be even more of yourself than you've ever been before. And I said, I thrive in high pressure moments and get anxious and depressed when things are too calm, which is a very common symptom of people with my kind of disorder. All right, let's go back again. So this is my little brother, Tristan. In 2006, this is the same year I graduated Evergreen State College. That New Year's, it was actually New Year's 2005 going into 06. My brother was last seen at around 12:15 a.m. and he went missing for about 30 days until his body washed ashore in the bay in Hoquiam, Washington. He apparently committed suicide. He was last seen at a bar, and no one had seen him for a long time after that. And that was the most devastating part, I think, was those 30 days that you don't know where he went. Around this time, I'm also cooking. I was trained as a cook, and just to pay my way through college, really. We're gonna circle back around to this. I can feel it in my heart, so I'm gonna just go into this other thing about cooking. When I was a chef, I was a multitasker, right? This is a good ADHD moment. A lot of people with these disorders are in kitchens, as you can imagine. Have you ever worked in a restaurant? Anyone? Everyone? At least a little bit? There's a lot of people, especially in the back of the house, with mental illness. And this kid that I just met yesterday, he looked like he was 20 on Lexapro, like so cheery. Okay. Oh, he was so nice. He was nice. Anyway, when I was a chef, I was a multitasker, right? I have shit in the oven, in the fryer. I'm sautéing stuff in the sauté station. I got stuff in the smoker, on the grill, another oven. I'm screaming at my cooks. My dishwasher is dancing, and for some reason, screaming at my servers and my business partner. And then I have to put on a nice face to greet my customers when I go out into the dining area. It was a lot of work, and I was really good at it. And it changed the way that we thought of food in this tiny little surf town in Puerto Rico that only sold like hot dogs and shitty sandwiches and beans and rice, which is great, you know, but it gets old. So I used this multidisciplinary way of looking at the world and try to incorporate French and Spanish techniques that I learned from other chefs and use Puerto Rican ingredients. And if I missed home, if I missed the Southwest, I would make all my green sauce and red sauce and import chilies and beans. And, oh man, it was so good. The year that Tristan died, I graduated from college, and my older brother Ray and I had an art show. And these two pictures kind of represent that on the right side. And one of the projects was to capture us going in the water. And these are some photos of where he was found, and the bridge that I kind of imagined that he fell from. I'm sorry, I'm gonna get through this. I'm gonna get through it. He was an autodidact like me, and very smart, very incredible human being. So obviously this was very traumatizing, and we thought that this art show in Seattle was gonna really kind of help us with our grief and our hurt. And to some respect it did. And immediately after that show, which was in October that year, I went to Puerto Rico in December. Just suddenly somebody called us up out of the blue, and I was with my partner living in this dank basement in Portland, and it was just smelled awful, like mildew and mold. And it's the middle of winter, Oregon. It's like this, right? So we see, hell yeah, let's go do it. She was the front house person, I was the back house person. And we went down there and started running this place, this tiny little hotel and a tiny little kitchen. And had like 30 seats and a little tiny kitchen that was maybe the size of 2 of these tables put together. And we started with like 5 things on the menu, and slowly I added new things. And as I grew and as I got better as a chef, we got a little bit better, or I got better, and then the menu grew. Years later, we got a second restaurant. The first one closed. We just stopped running that place, and we adopted this larger restaurant. It was right on the water, right on the marina. And fishermen would come right in and unload their trucks in the back of my, like they pull from the water and then pull back up to the door of my kitchen and unload like hundreds of pounds of tuna or mahi or dorado or snapper, spiny lobster, mako shark, all kinds of good stuff. But while I'm cooking, while I'm cutting all this fish up in Puerto Rico in this my now big kitchen, that river of consciousness is still flowing, right? While we're doing one thing, we're always thinking about other things. And so while I'm slaughtering hundreds of pounds of tuna, I'm probably thinking about my brother, I'm thinking about grief, right? And I already was a nervous wreck. I hadn't been diagnosed. In the restaurant industry, you rely on the cycle of caffeine and alcohol. And I didn't realize that was my medicine, right? That was my medicine at the time, to deal with the cycling. And I had to leave eventually. And so after 9 years, I shipped my car to Florida and drove across the country and started writing anything that I could. And I didn't know what I was writing. I didn't know how to write about tragedy or grief or a traumatic event. I felt lost. I didn't know what my home was. I didn't know what home was anymore. I felt in my blood, beneath my skin, and wanted to trace it from the inside outward rather than the outside in. In my phenomenology study, I learned about this guy, Gaston Bachelard. He wrote these chapters on shells and nests. And when you're drawn to it, those images of shells and nests, those are homes. As I dove further in and writing into the unknown, it led me to look into types of PTSD and depression, anxiety. I read about various serotonin neural reuptake inhibitors and mind-altering substances which can remap the much travailed lanes in our brains to help us out of the ruts. And then there's evidence of Western medicine that trauma can be passed down through chromosomes. Our family can suffer complex PTSD, the feeling of fight or flight, sustained and ingrained in our DNA. So even if we do not have their stories, we have their blood. After Tristan died, let's go listen. See what this is. Oh, this is one of my art projects. Before I left left Evergreen, I was a photo major, and this is the kind of stuff I was already thinking about. Before my brother died, I was kind of obsessed with this death sequence, I guess, in this dream sequence. So, where am I now? If art is the transference of one consciousness to another, I believe that literature is the best technology that we have at capturing that consciousness. Does that make sense? Literature is a technology, like written word is a technology. And if art is that transference of one consciousness to another, we have the capability of revising those stories, revising that consciousness before we pass it on. I feel like I'm repeating myself now. So let me come back around to this. This is my book. And there's a short piece in here that kind of speaks to how, before I even knew what CPTSD was, and before I knew how to find that language to speak to the grief and trauma that we live with every day, I had to invent a new language, right? And in using the vocabulary that I've learned through photography, filmmaking, reading, writing, learning that sensory language of the kitchen, and when you start thinking about the sensory, you realize that that's what the writing is trying to do at all times. Like, in order to capture consciousness, you need a body. And in order to capture the body, you need sensory language. I'm just going to read this short chapter here. How am I doing on time? Right. So this chapter is called Souffle of Sea. Sometimes Damien imagines grief like it's stuck in your throat, and you can't swallow or cough it up, and you can breathe, but only barely. The thing in your throat is not sharp or a loogie. It is not some foreign object or food or a hair or a fly. It is not your tongue or the words you can't say or a tooth. Your neck gets thick, grows out sideways as if around the thing that's stuck in your throat. Like how a tree will grow around fencing wire and the wire becomes a part of it. It happens when another tree is in the way. They become entangled before they become one. Tie a bicycle to the trunk and wait 20 years and see what they turn into, each their own but not the same. The thing that is stuck in your throat becomes you, and it takes a long time for you to feel the hurt because it is an incredibly slow process, not unlike the birth of stars. This is also how memory works. Loss, the ache of the past, drips down your nasal cavities into the back of your throat and gullet where it lodges, nests, takes a nap as it swells. How else could you explain it? You can't eat a fish whole and expect it to slide on down to where it's supposed to go for proper digestion. You can't wash it down with liquor. No medicinal syrup can loosen the phlegm. No smoke from tobacco or weed will whisk away its bitter sting. If you try to deceive yourself of its existence, you become a monster. Because if you no longer exist, you must be a monster. Deny that it has been metastasized, and it will spread from your tree rings into organs whose purpose you have long questioned. It is not like the pain in your back from kitchen work. It is far worse to have something stuck in your throat. Soon you'll have sappy tumors like the ponderosas. Your neck will grow its own neck, and a new throat will open up. But that's not how it works. Or it is, but growing another throat won't remove the hurt. If you grow around the thing and it grows into you, resisting makes it hurt worse. There's no removing the thing in your throat. You live with it, you die with it. Perhaps you find a new way to breathe, but the thing will still be in your body. Then grow hard skin, scales. Amputate every piece of you. Remove the unnecessary offal, the extra chambered heart. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he is tree or fish or man or bee. We bleed and cry and die. we lose. But there is relief in water. Damien thinks he can breathe better down there. It will take practice breathing this new way. His sense of smell is more acute in the desert, but in the briny water, smell is taste, taste is smell. Skip the middle sense. If he thought he could taste without a nose, this is what it would be like. Watery and mystical and heavily salted. Souffle of sea. He is blind in the water, and when you eat blind, flavors change. He is to trust what falls into his mouth with his life and hope there is no hook. So, where was I? There's some. Really? It's gonna be you, that guy? So there's some pictures of some of my food. You can see how there is a palette to the texture. There's a colorful palette. There's a synesthesia that I learned that I had, where if a dish didn't taste right, I knew it needed a little bit of red or green. This is my mom on the left, but in Navajo culture, they're all my mom's sisters are all my moms, so I have like 5 moms. It's really difficult. Yeah, I think I kind of. So I'm not going to talk about special ed today, but I just wanted to show some of these pictures. How are we doing on time? I'm sorry, I don't even know. I got a little bit more time, so wrap it up. You're with me? Does it make sense to you? Oh, yeah. Because I feel confused. So I feel like the writing I'm trying to explain itself, and I think that's a good place to leave it. But I think what I'm trying to get to is that when we are dealing with our traumas and our griefs, which we all have, which we are born with in some way or another, we have the ability to revise and to look at ourselves and to say that I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just really excited. I'm not bipolar necessarily. It's a spectrum. It's a way of looking at the world, right? I'm very sensitive to the world around me. I don't have ADHD necessarily. It's not a disorder, it's a superpower. If you can use it in the right way. Being a novelist, though, is the worst thing for someone with ADHD. I don't know how to organize anything, obviously. But we have the ability to work on that, right? I mean, I'm not trying to be somebody else. I'm trying to use what I've been given to say the things that I need to say that I don't know how to say. And that means giving a man gills because he's suffering from the loss of his brother because he needs a new way to breathe. And he goes off on this adventure. And there's nothing more to say about that really, but it's a healing process, right? And it's always going to be there with us, and it's never going to leave our bodies, no matter what. And we can use that for good, whatever that means. So thank you so much. Those are the mushrooms I had this morning. Some of these are from Cape Cod. This is the desert. That's where I'm from. That was me in high school. Trying to grow a beard. Thank you.